is to create a program that has never existed here before, which introduces children into the world of learning in a very joyful way and makes them understand that they can achieve anything that they want to in the future.
Have to share something. Let them share not Terminator, not Rambo, which is now the case, but Sesame Street.
My name is Alexandra Vacru, and I'm the
Welcome back, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speakers, Natasha Lance Rogoff. Natasha, of course, is the author of Muppets in Moscow, available everywhere. I'll briefly read a synopsis of the story from the front cover. In Muppets of Moscow, the unexpected, crazy, true story of making Sesame Street in Russia, Natasha Lance Rogoff brings the gripping tale to life. Amid bombings, assassinations, and a military takeover of the production office, Lance Rogoff and the talented team of Moscow artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers, and puppeteers remain determined to bring laughter and a new way of seeing the world to children throughout the former Soviet Empire. The book has received praise from Bill Browder, as we saw there, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and even actress Virginia Madsen. And now I'll introduce Matt Orr, who will introduce Dr. Tom Garza, who'll be moderating the discussion.
Gosh, I think that captivating video really set the stage for this topic. Well, yes, and our discussant today is Dr. Thomas Jesus Garza. Dr. Garza is a professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies and the director of the Texas Liberal Arts Texas Language Center here at UT Austin, in addition to being a beloved professor by all of us here and at the LBJ School in Crees and really anyone who comes into contact with him. And he was one of my thesis advisors, for which I'm forever grateful. And I think that he's really going to be the perfect person to really conduct this discussion on such a fascinating topic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. This is such both a timely but also rather incredible moment, I think, in history. The previous panels from the last days, but even the ones just before us today, I think have brought back the notion, if you didn't watch at all the video that just opened this session, of quite how important I think we're going to see in the next few years, certainly over the remainder of the 20s, looking back at the 90s as being a really crucial point in, at that time's post-Soviet American relations and how they feed into today. I can't think of a better way of looking back at those times and with a more influential and informed person to talk about them than Natasha. Natasha, please, welcome to University of Texas, welcome to Austin, and welcome to Connexions.
Thank you so much for that, and it's my first time in Texas, and I'm absolutely blown away by this conference and everybody who organized it. It's been a tremendous experience so far, so thank you.
Well, let's get into this because I think our time's limited and I certainly want to leave time for some robust questions from the audience here. That little video footage reminds us of quite how, to use the Russian term, lichia, mad, crazy, the 90s were after the fall of the Soviet Union. So immediately to me, the question of Muppets in Moscow begs the question, so what was the origin story of how an American treasure, cultural icon like Sesame Street finds its way into Russia at this time? Where did the idea come from? Who was behind it? And why, of all the cultural products coming from the United States, Sesame Street would be what finds its way into New Russia?
Well, it was so fascinating to hear the discussion of the incredibly brave women from VOA talking about human rights, promoting democracy, and that's really the origin of how Sesame Street came about in Russia. It was originally spearheaded by Sesame Workshop, formerly called the Children's Television Workshop, which is a nonprofit, and also then Senator Biden, Joe Biden, who had arranged to, he had convinced, the Congress to support the creation of a Russian version. And when I say a Russian version, it's not an import, it's an original version created, in the case of Улица Sesame, which means Sesame Street in Russian, with about 400 artists living in Moscow. Those are Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians. The Georgians were many of the animators for some reason. And, people from all across the former Soviet Union. And this show then, they worked with the Ministry of Education, but the show itself was created independently. And the whole premise of the idea of creating the show was we used a very different approach from other programs that had been done at Sesame Street before, because we wanted to create an infrastructure for independent media. And when the executives at Sesame Street first approached me, this is just after the Soviet Union had collapsed. And of course, there were so many Americans over there and Westerners. And of course, we thought, well, this is an incredible way to, bring openness to the society with our friends, the Muppets. And so, that was the idea, that the Muppets could model, open values, similar to what the gentleman was talking about, from Voice of America in the 1980s, as well as modeling really important skills that young children would need to thrive in this new open society, which it did not exist yet. And it was incredibly difficult for all of us trying to create this children's television show to imagine, what was it going to look like? What was the show going to look like? What kinds of themes and values would it have?
Wow. So as you returned, as you found yourself back in the early 90s, returning to Moscow to begin to lay the ground for this monumental undertaking, to begin this production, you write in the book, this is in the introduction, considering that I'd spent more than a decade working in the former Soviet Union before Sesame Street approached me, I ought to have been more prepared for the fierce resistance we faced. So could you kind of lay out what were the most striking differences that you experienced back in the Soviet Union of the 80s, which you were so familiar with, and those wild 90s that you revisited?
Well, it was way more chaotic. And I had been making documentary films and news in what was then the Soviet Union for NBC and for PBS television beforehand. But what changed, and when I went back, and of course, I wasn't a children's television producer. I made, serious documentaries, embedding myself with, for instance, the conservative nationalists who were willing to do anything to prevent the Soviet Union from imploding. And so it was a very different experience working with this group of artists, but it was also a time of, incredible hope and joy, combined with an enormous amount of chaos, violence, and, fiscal trauma. So the people we were working with, the center of the government had fallen apart, and the president, Boris Yeltsin, was weak. And at this point, the oligarchs were rising up. And we had many situations where although the US government was putting some funding into it, we had to match that funding because they wanted Russia to have skin in the game. And this led to a number of our broadcast partners being assassinated, as well as people we were trying to raise money from, 3 weeks after doing a negotiated deal, the oligarch. This was Boris Berezovsky at the time, and he was blown up in a car bombing. But he survived, of course. Yeah. But those were some of the traumas, and for our team, just incredible difficulties of the food shortages, the devaluating ruble, a political vacuum, essentially.
So this quite seemingly catastrophic landscape you're describing reminds me very much from one of your early chapters in the book, in chapter 3, your trusted contact in Moscow that you write quite a bit about. This is Leonid Zagalsky. He kind of warned you off. You quote him in the book saying, I love this because I can hear a Russian saying this to almost any American trying to do business in the early 90s. Moscow is not like the place you left, he says. I'm actually worried for you because it's a lot more violent now, as you were describing. And then he talks about the U.S. efforts to, quote, implement a harebrained idea to convert state-owned enterprises into private ones and then distribute the country's wealth in the form of vouchers, giving each citizen a little piece of what's left of Russia. You then finish this by saying, Leonid is clearly upset by these efforts and says, this is the biggest fire sale of the century. Everything's for sale. Soviet factories, oil refineries, even our beautiful forests. So I know I'm asking you to kind of reel it back of 30 years plus, but what was your thinking at that moment in regard to a launch of an American cultural treasure like Sesame Street in these conditions and these dire circumstances? This was a time when so many people in the West were evangelizing capitalism and having this experience of imagining that through sort of shock therapy economics, the country would move quickly to democracy. And it was very naive. And, I was part of that too, because I certainly had anticipated that when I accepted the job, I didn't think it was going to take 5 years of my life to raise the money and produce the show and to have the kind of, incidences we had of friends getting killed. That's not what you think of when you're about to make a children's puppet show. And but I would say that, what really kept me and my colleagues from the workshop there and the hundreds of Moscow TV professionals and artists working on it were really the prospect of how the show could impact the country. And the heart and soul of that experience was the curriculum seminar, where we had to come up with the ideas, the content, the goals that the show would teach. And it was in that process of working with education experts, the creative team, that I came to understand that making a children's TV show was so totally different from making a documentary or news. And that when you are a doc producer or your news, you're always on the outside somehow. You're observing. And then you go home. But in this case, our team, we were all working together towards one goal. And when you speak with people about what they want for their children, it's a very intimate discussion. It's totally different from politics. And it's also very emotional. So that was what I wasn't prepared for, I think, was, how much it was the stakes were going to be very high. And at the same time, the potential of, creating a new vision of what Russia could be, first on the little screen, and then later, hopefully, in real life, was what really motivated everybody through this very difficult period. Well, I definitely want to return to the educational content and decisions made there in just a bit, but you made a mention of securing funding for this, again, the enterprise, funding this project was clearly, from the book, again, one of the most difficult parts to getting to production. as I understood it. And in recalling a difficult meeting that you had with Baxter Urist, I believe, is that right? Yes, the Sesame Street group president of Products and International TV at the time, you wrote about his exchange. Sesame Street is a legitimate institution that conducts business with reputable governments and operates according to international laws. I don't know if I'm sounding angry enough for the comment. What you're proposing is a Ponzi scheme cooked up by a bunch of corrupt businessmen. Heard comments like that quite a bit in the 90s. But how then for you, with all these obstacles, not least of which was securing reliable financial funding in support in Moscow, did the show finally start production, which you go on to describe in part 2 of the book, which we'll get to. But the funding part is...
Our secret was a woman named Irina Borisova, who was our golden goose. And I write about her quite a lot in the book because she was somebody I absolutely fell in love with, but was also my nemesis because she kept running out of money. And also her accounts were constantly getting frozen by the Russian government tax organization. And it was very difficult, but her heart was in this show. She had a young daughter who was 8 years old at the time. And, she was there for the many years that it took to make the show. And this also included endless discussions, like about, what was the neighborhood going to look like, the Sesame Street neighborhood. And, in the U.S., it's a, urban setting like Harlem in New York. In Norway, it's a train station. In South Africa, it's a marketplace. So what was Russia's going to be look like, when it was going to be for the entire former Soviet Union? And that became such a fascinating discussion about, how are we going to build this new neighborhood when we don't know what the future looks like for our country? And should this set look like, pre-revolutionary Russia? Should it look like post-Soviet era Russia? Or should it look like some futuristic, society that we don't know what it looks like yet? But it was people like, Irina who were willing to finance the show, and we were able to cover expenses when we didn't have them. That was the workshop. And they were incredibly brave to do this because it wasn't easy for a corporation that is used to, selling Muppets and plush, and at the same time producing Sesame Street in the U.S., in a perfectly, peaceful studio compared to the one we were in. So most corporations probably would have bailed on it a lot sooner, and the workshop deserves so much credit for staying in and continuing to support it. And that was Baxter Urist, my boss, who he was a very special corporate guy. It was a unbelievable confluence of forces that came together that made it possible for this show to exist. And to this day, I have CEOs from like Coca-Cola who come up and say, how was that possible? Because the show went on, to air for another 10 years, well into Putin's era. And I meet people from all over the world who grew up on the show. So
when I think of the idea of the placement, literally the locus of what does a Sesame Street look like in a Russian city or village or town or whatever, it does just pose all of the problems kind of in one question. So you secure approval to begin production. Ultimately, all these issues of, and I know I'm misusing a term here, but of translating, because as you said, it's not simply a Russian version of Sesame Street, it's a reimagining of Sesame Street in a Russian vernacular.
Based on Russian culture and values, or what I think of as post-Soviet, because it also included elements from the former republics that were now, many of them, independent countries.
Well,
Ukraine.
I definitely want to come back to the multinational question as well in a moment. But you, again, I love your comments on recalling concerns that you had, even talking about these beloved figures we have sitting around us. How do you reimagine the characters that are already known in many countries around the world? You had suggestions of, for those of who do Russian, will know Petrushka and Baba Yaga as being the Russian equivalents of these our beloved characters. And you comment, how can this be? In the case of Petrushka, a spouse abuser. In the case of Baba Yaga, a child eater. We can't have them in Sesame Street. But your chapter 8 is particularly evocative in its discussion of the role that music was going to play in, as it does in the original Sesame Street, what it's going to play in Sesame.
Well, let me address the creation
Please.
of the Muppets first,
Please.
and then music. And I thought when that would be the easiest part, because I showed my colleagues, video from the American Sesame Street show and from other international co-productions, and they looked at the Muppets and they just said, "We don't like them." And I thought, "Oh no!" and then the head director at the time, she said, "Natasha, we have a long puppet tradition dating back to the 16th century, and we'd prefer to make the puppet show with our puppets." And I thought, okay, well, Sesame Street hired me, and normally we include the Muppets. And it didn't end there. We were at Spokojny Moloshi, the show for young children, a Russian television show that was hugely distributed across the former Soviet Union. And they also wanted to put in their Krusha the pig. This discussion about the Muppets went on for months, and I thought it was going to, start World War III. I mean, we just could not come to terms. The head of live action film, he said, you have your Muppets, but our puppets are not naked. So he is.
Elmo looks good in his T-shirt.
In his Texas Slavic. but everything changed. Eventually they came to the United States for a training session at the workshop in New York City, and they met a lot of the incredibly talented veteran producers. And the head of animation, the executive producer of Sesame Street, the puppeteers, and they started understanding, how they could create Muppets, but in their own image. That it didn't have to be exactly like what Elmo looked like or what Big Bird looked like. And when we came back to Moscow, they came up with the idea of basing their Muppet, their full body size, full body Muppet, on a character from Russian folklore called Domovoi, which is the spirit of the house and the home, the hearth and the home. And but normally he's drawn like an old man with like really beady eyes, and he's kind of scary looking, like a lot of the puppets that are made there, by very famous puppeteers, Bratsov and others. But their expressions are often exaggerated. And, the Muppets are like usually really friendly looking. And they're also often children. They're also often, the idea is that the character can be playful and curious and make mistakes. And that was the whole idea of trying to create this new, Sesame Street world where children would be express themselves freely and make mistakes and not be yelled at, with the often heard nizia, no. So eventually I brought their initial drawings back to Jim Henson Productions, and the chief designer looked at them and said, I could just tell he was not happy. And he also voiced a lot of the same ideas. It really, it should be a childlike puppet. So I went back and talked with the team again, And eventually, they came up with this idea of converting Domovoy into this enormous, kind of like hound-like character who's taller than Big Bird. He's blue and his coat is filled with moss and leaves, and all of these are sewn into his costume. And his name is Zeliboba, and he is a tree spirit. So he is at one with nature. And eventually he ended up living inside a 40-foot tree, of which the bark and all the leaves had to be imported from the United States. So that was, but I will say what was most fascinating about this, which, dovetails with a lot of the discussions here over the last 2 days, is how the content for the show was developed. So at the curriculum seminar, we had a group of 40 people. This is education experts and creative team. We discussed things that had to do with gender, inclusivity, how do you introduce and model certain skills so that children could adapt to a new open market or free market. And, there was a lot of learning along the way. At one point when we were discussing how to create scripts that would focus on an open market, I said, well, why don't we have a scenario where kids sell lemonade? Like we have our children, lemonade stand. You remember this from the book. And, they just looked at me in horror, my colleagues, and they said, you mean children sell things on the street? You mean like the mafia and criminals? And then I thought, oh, right, yeah, we're not that far from Soviet Union. And I thought, okay, yeah, that is true. They were, people were incarcerated for, speculation for, independent commerce. So that was one moment. And then there were also some other really surprising moments, like when we were moving to a discussion of inclusivity, and I showed a video of an American Sesame Street segment of a little boy in a wheelchair, and he was flying a kite with a friend, and there's a little upbeat song, me and my chair, we go everywhere. And when I turn off the VCR, which it was then, people are looking at each other, and someone says, That's so exploitative, showing children in wheelchairs. And that also was not what I was expecting. And then another woman, a health education expert, asks, why would normalnie dzieci, normal children, ever want to watch a TV show with not normal children? And it was the words, in compared to where we were in the U.S. that were, very startling. And it was, the conversation went on among the group, and I was becoming very depressed. And I just thought, wow, we are so far apart on our values and what we're trying to do here, in this new open society. We had a break, and, I ended up going outside to, we were having the seminar in the Danilov Monastery, which was kind of ironic, considering we were trying to create this new open spiritual show for this new country with our colleagues. But when I came back, the discussion was still going on. There was no consensus. The consensus was basically we shouldn't have children, represented with disabilities in the show. And then there was a woman in the back of the room who hadn't spoken yet at all during the conference. And she says, my name is Ludmila Chipurina, and I work with children with disabilities every day. She says, we have the highest percentage of these children because our area, which stretched from the Volga to Siberia, was used as a dumping ground for hazardous chemicals. And then she says to the group, I don't see why you can't include these children in storylines for the show. And, they yearn to play with normal children. She used the words again. And then she said, they need to be represented as valued in our society. And she finishes speaking, and I look around the room, and many of the people are crying. And, I'm losing it as well. And I realized that, they were embarrassed. They were also embarrassed in front of the Americans that were in the room. You just got a sense in that moment of the incredible humiliation that, ordinary Russians were experiencing as their country was falling apart. Unfortunately, this is a narrative that is used over and over again by Putin today for other purposes and to justify his own horrific war against Ukraine. But what happened at that moment is the group came together and decided that they needed to represent children, with disabilities. And this led to the next discussion, which had to do with nationality discussions and how other minority groups would be represented in the show, which they came to a consensus on doing as well.
May I, since you've opened that door just a bit here, because I think for especially an audience that has, from our students' perspectives, a number of millennial and Gen Z perspectives, which I think have a lot more resilience in discussing issues of social justice. I thought you did in your book incredible justice to this topic. And if I may cite for you and then ask you if you would comment on that move toward inclusivity and diversity in the ethnic and racial sense. You write, so I found this to be this is in your chapter 10, it's unusually a poignant and for us timely moment. You write about a time when your Russian colleagues met with Dr. Valeria Lovelace, the director of research at Sesame Street, who was a young African-American PhD holder, determined that children's television would portray positive images of people of color. In your chapter, you recount how she explains Sesame Street's effort, as you were already describing, to battle racism on television, especially given the audience being young children. And in the real world, by being able to show, for example, white children visiting the homes of their black friends. So about this exchange you wrote, and I'm now citing you here, I'd hoped my Russian colleagues would take Valeria's talk to heart, relating it to racial discrimination in their own country. But the Russians look at each other confused. To my horror, I overhear Lida whispering to her husband, the creative director, doesn't she know that we don't have any blacks in Russia? So, in the next chapter, you do talk about the conversation that Sesame Street had to have about race, especially if this is the early 90s, about the Northern Caucasus, the Chechen War was on the brink of beginning. Please comment on this.
That discussion happened in the U.S. and Dr. Lovelace, did an amazing job that particular year. The theme of all the episodes of Sesame Street was race, I spoke with Dr. Lovelace recently, and we were talking about the situation with George Floyd, and we couldn't believe where we were today, again. And in the case of the Russian discussion, it was incredibly challenging because the curriculum seminar was going on at the same time that the Budynovsk attack happened, the same exact days. So the fact that our workshop just didn't fall apart was incredible.
that was due to the strength of the director of research, Dr. Anna Genina, who convinced the team to stay, and they spoke about how are we going to be inclusive and include elements of different culture from the different nationality groups, including the Chechens, who were also discriminated against. So that was a phenomenally successful moment where the team was able to discuss this and put aside the anger that they felt, as I believe that was the first attack by a former brethren of the Soviet Union against Russian nationals. So our show was very progressive in that way, very much in the same ways that the American show was. But there were also really incredible differences in terms of how the scripts were written too, and the differences between the U.S. show and Ulitsa Sesam. And I wanted to tell one story about a particular script where we were trying to teach the concept of happy versus sad. And the script that one of the Russian writers had submitted showed a little boy and a little girl holding a balloon, and they were walking in the park together. And the little boy lets go of his balloon, and he starts crying. And the little girl looks at him, and then she lets go of her balloon. And the two of them hold hands, and they watch their balloons go up into the sky together. And when I read that script, my first reaction was, why didn't they share the other balloon? And my teammates really laughed at me, and they go, you don't understand. This is happiness. Sharing in that moment of beauty together. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, this resonates so much with so much Russian literature that I had read, like the Master and the Slave, and, where it's like, we find happiness in having nothing together. But it went into the show as they wrote it, and it's a beautiful, beautiful segment.
Thank you for all of that, because it, as I say, I think the topic itself, the subject matter of equity and inclusion is just one that we're all talking about, and to think about this same conversation happening 30 years ago in an incredibly, though it was always billed as the многонациональная страна, многонациональный Советский Союз, this great multi-ethnic entity, we knew that these racisms and isms existed all across the country, and you were dealing with these in real time as we all were watching the country
Well, I think,
change.
yeah, I also feel that, what's most poignant in telling this story now from the 1990s, and, when I was writing it during COVID, the war hadn't happened yet. Our relations with Russia were already deteriorating. And I went back in 2016 and then again in January of 2020 to interview people for the book. And I was already thinking that a lot of these same issues that we had faced while making the children's television show were similar. Yeah. That they, even some of the themes, that dealt with Russian pride, the, Russia, being out to destroy, or America being out to destroy Russia, these same narratives that Putin's using were evident at that point too, including criticism of our show in Russia, there were many articles written in Ogonyok magazine, and how, this was an imported show that was going to poison the minds of Russian children. Of course, our team numbered literally 400 artists, so they were all from the former Soviet Union. And the show, if you saw it today, you would see it is a very, very Russian show.
So as I'm thinking now, moving through the process of getting, you've talked so much about this lengthy process to get it from conception, inception of an idea to actual production. As Ulica Sesam finally gets close to its debut. So I'm going to jettison forward in your book toward the end, where you say, the chaos in the final days of constructing the sets and decorations, you wrote, one day Masha pulls me aside and tells me she's worried. I still have to decorate the entire set, all the room interiors, the furniture, the lights, pictures on the walls, bric-a-brac, to make the settings look real and lived in. And then you say, I tell her to stop and breathe. Take a moment to appreciate what you and your crew have created. It's remarkable. Actually, I have to admit I'm feeling the same way now, 30 years later. Again, asking you to do the little time travel here. Can you take us back to that moment? Can you remember that? What did you actually think, this is actually going to happen? Or quite the reverse, is all this time we've put into this and this may not happen? Where was your thinking at this point just before the actual switch gets turned on?
I think that throughout the making of this show, there were so many starts and stops and so many disruptions between, partners getting killed, deals getting canceled, our production office getting taken over by soldiers with AK-47s, and then all the cultural, I would say, cultural clashes, or let's call them bumps, because we got over most of them. But, you had asked about music before. And, initially, Sesame Street in the U.S. is known for its innovative music, very diverse music. But the director of music for Ulica Sesam only wanted to have classical music. And her answer to me when I said, well, what about all these, rock musicians who had been, persecuted under communism? They weren't allowed to record their music. They couldn't sell their music. One of the key things that made me want to work on this, accept the job and work on Ulica Sesam was that I had made a film earlier on underground rock and roll and with Jackie Oakes. And the idea was that we could, bring these musicians in and they could express themselves freely for the first time, on national television. But the music director said, people have been playing, Stravinsky and Tchaikovsky for 100 years. Who do you think's going to play Sesame Street songs 100 years from now? So I thought, she's probably right, but but we're still singing Rubber Ducky. But anyway, eventually I had her meet one of my friends from the 1980s who had become a rock superstar. And she was terrified to meet him because he was wearing, leather and he had an earring. And I don't think she was ever in the same room with somebody like that. And she came back just glowing. And they discovered they had children the same age. And my friend had also studied classical music before becoming a, rock superstar. And eventually, it was all her. She opened it up, and we had, the most incredible music for this show, much of which is available on the internet now, because some of the musicians at Sesame Street in the States, when they've listened to it, they said this is as good as the early years of Sesame Street. But getting back to your question about that feeling, I don't think I ever felt that we were going to actually get the show on air. We did not get a broadcast deal until after we had finished all the production. That's not how you usually make a TV show. And we had broadcast deals at various times, but they were eliminated after the partners were assassinated. So when we were in the set at that moment, first of all, starting to build the set was a huge, just an amazing feeling of like, wow, it's really happening. There are houses that are, being constructed here, and we had dachas and brick-style buildings from pre-revolutionary Russia and Soviet. Khrushchevsky, the large Soviet buildings. And when I saw, one day I came into the studio, and there were 12 women crouched on the floor sewing leaves into this tree, this 40-foot tree. So we had to import 60 boxes of bark and all the leaves. And the leaves had to have 6 points. They were oak leaves, not 8 points, because the 6-point leaves are Russian oak leaves, and the 8-point ones are American ones, and that was very important. So that was the point. We had, everybody knows how incredibly artistically brilliant the Russians are, and this production really benefited from that. We were able to create a team mostly from theater and film, because there really wasn't much sophisticated TV production. It was mostly propaganda prior to that. So we had the top children's cinema director, Volodya Gramatikov, and we had people, the Masha, who you just described, she'd never built a set for television before. She came from theater. But I would say, even as we were filming the production over the next 4 months in the studio in Ostankino, in Russia's largest TV station, we did not have a broadcaster. So everybody, the puppeteers, everybody is like, what, we're doing this, but we don't know where it's going to go. And at the same time, we had the re-election of Boris Yeltsin, and people were terrified that Zhuganov would win, who was a communist, and we would have communism back. So all of this is going on. And all I can say is, like artists all over the world all the time, there was a certain suspension of disbelief. And this tremendous spirit of what many of the people who spoke here earlier, discussed, the mission, the sense that it's bigger than you, that you are a part of it, and your worries have to fall aside in order for you to move forward. If you could, for many of these people, like for VOA, correspondents and many of the correspondents in Ukraine today, I'm sure if they thought too much, they wouldn't be there. And if they have children, it's even scarier. So I think for everybody working on the show, it was just one step at a time. And then that day when the show premiered, I went outside. We had, this was in October of 1996, and we had taken over a theater for the show's premiere. And I was with my colleague, Leonid Zagalsky, who was a former journalist who had covered, he broke the first story about political prisoners in psychiatric hospitals in the 1980s. And we had been friends now for 35 years. And we went outside together, and as we looked up, we saw all of these Soviet-style buildings, and it turned 6 o'clock, and suddenly all the windows started changing color in unison. So it was like red, 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 blue, like this. And we realized that we had a lot of press about the show, and the families were watching Ulitsa Sesame. And all I could think about was, the, bus drivers, the, waitresses, the school teachers, all these people who are now sitting there with their children watching the show. And it was broadcast across 11 time zones. on Russia's 2 top TV stations, and became a hit very quickly.
So just for those who haven't read the book, and by the way, as you might guess, I read this book just a couple of weeks ago, and I really recommend everyone to read this. It's just a remarkable story, and it's more than an account of the creation of Sesame Street in Russia. It's like a time capsule of the 1990s and what attempts being made to, in what today we sort of, I think, incorrectly call soft power, used cultural products and policies to try to make those years go by better. And if I may, you've already said it, but I just have to say your language in describing that moment is unbelievably poignant. You write, this is your last chapter, as the sky darkens, we notice how the yellow lights in several of the windows began to change color in unison, from bright red to bright blue to green. As another building across the way, we see the same thing, colored lights reflecting in the windows, shifting simultaneously. Suddenly it dawns on us, on both of us, that it's 6 o'clock. It's October 22nd, 1996. Is it possible, I love that you put it as a question, but end it with an exclamation point. Is it possible that the families have turned on the television sets and are all watching Улица Sesame, exclamation point. So nearly three decades later, you've described what the moment was like for you, but was it all worth it in retrospect? Is there anything you would do differently in the bringing that show? You built it and they came, but would you do it differently if you could?
Well, it's incredibly heartbreaking to see where we are today. And think about where we were 30 years ago, and think about what was lost. And it's very painful to talk with my former colleagues. The chief director is now in his 90s, and I quote him in the book. I'm not going to say what he said because it's just too depressing. But I will say that I absolutely think it was worth it. And it's incredible how many people I talk to, random people, both in the United States, in Europe, and when I was last in Russia, I was in Moscow and checking into the hotel in January of 2020. And then I kind of shyly asked these 2 young women who were checking me in if by chance they had heard of Улица Sesame, and they just started, oh yes, and started telling their favorite, segments and which one was their favorite, Slavic Muppet. And, this is the legacy of Sesame Street. And I woke up one morning at 4 o'clock. I couldn't sleep. And this was after I had just seen these newsreels of the more than 1 million Russians leaving Russia because they didn't want to fight and they didn't support the war. And it occurred to me, looking at them, that that's the Улица Sesame generation. They grew up on our show. And then I, was lying there still more, just, thinking about how the same age cohort in the Ukraine that are now fighting for their freedom also grew up on Улица Sesame. And, that was comforting because I've had so many conversations with people who talk about the vision, the world that was created in that show when they were children, that enabled them to embrace values that were very different from what was the Soviet Union at the time. And I am hopeful that, this war will end, all wars end, and, it's programs like this, like Connexions, like, where students are studying the soft power options, the way to collaborate with local journalists and artists to produce something that can have that kind of impact. So we were able to do that, with government support and with local support, which is how I hope things will happen in the future. And I hope there's another time soon that these guys and their Slavic friends can come back to Russia. And there is a program now being done in Ukraine by Sesame Workshop. And they've partnered with local TV stations there now. So that will be happening too in the original language, in Ukrainian.
Fantastic. Well, I see we're coming close to the hour, and I wanted to be sure that we left a good chunk of time at the end here for open questions. But before I hand mics off to everyone else in the audience, please help me thank Natasha Lance Rogoff for this wonderful talk. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so we've got mics around the room.
Inspiring conversation. Good, it's working. You talked a lot about generations, and I'm really going to put myself in a generation here as an American late Gen X. I think a lot about Jim Henson and how he died so young and how it was so shocking in 1990. And I think the relationships are so interesting before the 1990s in the way Sesame Street inspired people in the 70s and 80s. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that prehistory, because there was that very special relationship that Henson had with the Moscow Theater and Sergei Obraztsov, right, Obraztsov. And I think that particular kind of translatability that you described so well, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm wondering if you can kind of unearth those values that Henson even tried to sort of transmit to Russia, right? Because there was Skala Fragrov too, right? The Fraggle Rock show, which was also, like, I think really, really cool when it first came out. It was on USA and, cable TV here in the United States. So, I mean, Henson's role is just so inspiring to me as a person. And the way he tried to, bring Kermit during Glasnost in a project that kind of failed, but ultimately was really rewarding by the late 80s and into the period that you write about. Thank you.
Stephen, could you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, sorry, Stephen Siegel. I'm Professor of Slavic and Eurasian Studies here. Thanks so much.
Great question, Stephen. Jim Henson predates my start at Sesame Workshop. And I came right after he died, very sadly. And the influence that he had in Russia was quite extensive, as you said. Although I don't write about it, and I don't have great knowledge about that. My training was with John Stone, who was the director of Sesame Street, the original director. And so I heard many stories from both John and from Jim's daughter, Cheryl Henson, who was part of the Ulica Sezam production. She was, on the side of Jim Henson Productions, but she actually trained the Russian puppeteers, and she came to Moscow, and she speaks some Russian. So that was incredible having her there. And the legacy, having her there with the Russians who knew about Jim Henson and the role that he had played in his earlier trips to Russia gave that tremendous poignancy. And I remember, many of them were like incredibly intimidated to, perform in front of her because of that. But she was so wonderful at, making everybody relax and, jumped right in and showed them how to puppeteer.
Obraztsov called Henson his father. I mean, they had a really close relationship, and I think that friendship was so important in the 80s. But thank you so much. I really look forward to your book reading.
Thank you.
Okay.
Dan Eggleston. Dan Eggleston. A couple questions. First of all, what was the cause for the end of the program? And second, Tom's introduction reminded me, do you know of the first American about 90 years ago who was came over to Russia and performed?
The first American?
Yes.
What do you mean, the first American that came?
American entertainer.
Oh, well, I don't know, but I don't know who the first was. Yeah.
Harpo Marx. His autobiography has a long section about his performance there, which I highly recommend.
That's great. No, I was familiar with, if anybody has read the book by Truman Capote, The Muses Are Heard, which was a Porgy and Bess performance in the 60s. That was an amazing book. But no, I didn't know that. Now I'm going to go back and look at that. Thanks for sharing that.
Right. At the end of the program in Russia, what was the cause?
The cost?
Why did
Sesame
Street? Why did it?
Well, what was the end of the cause? Okay, what was the cause? Well, the show ended in 2010, and I asked everybody that I was interviewing for more details about this, and it was very hard to get a concrete answer. What I did find is that there was a change in command at Russian television, at ORT, and at this point, Putin had put in place executives that were, creating more state supporting propaganda content. At the same time, they were crushing independent media, and there was a grab for the show. And they tried to fire the research director who had been there from the beginning. And when they did that, the rest of the crew quit in solidarity. And that was the end of the show.
And are there DVDs or such available for Russians to see the program?
DVDs. I don't. I mean, there are no. I don't know. I mean, people could, if once they had the internet, they could see stuff online, but they can't really access that right now. And I don't know how many people are using DVDs.
That would be, I was going to say that CDs and DVDs are almost non-existent, but digital format versions I saw as recent, of Ulica Sesame, I saw as recently as 2020 online. So it's out there, bits and pieces, but I think you're absolutely right. It's getting more and more difficult to access even, Russian-produced Western-style media. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, cool. This is on. Hi, my name is Grant. I'm an undergrad film student here. And so I just kind of wanted to ask, so you kind of started out your career in like documentary and then transitioned to something on the complete opposite end of the spectrum of like very imaginative narrative stories. And then you came back and wrote this book, which is like completely nonfiction, your own experience. So like, how did transitioning to narrative work for you? Like, how did you bring that documentary skill set? And then how did you pull narrative skill sets back into nonfiction? Or you can choose one path because that's kind of a lot.
That's a great question. I mean, first I would say, it's not like I really chose anything at any point. I even getting the job with Sesame Street, this happened at a screening of a documentary that I had just finished called Russia for Sale, The Rough Road to Capitalism. And it's like a historical, economic look at, the collapse of the Soviet Union and following a police chief, a steel worker, and a furniture guy, an earlier entrepreneur who had been put in prison. But when the executives came up to me and said, hey, could you help us bring Sesame Street to Russia? And I just said to them, did you just watch my film? It was not only people in prison, but, these nationalist fascists who, were spouting anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist diatribes. And, they just convinced me because I went down to the workshop and there were all these young people, your age, who were so earnest, and they convinced me that this would be great. But I had to learn how to make children's television, and I was lucky enough that it took so long to make Ulica Sesame. It took, really 5 years total, that I was put on the Plaza Sesamo show as a producer, so that I watched and was part of the making of Sesame Street in Mexico first. And that's how I learned, initially with John Stone, who was the director of Sesame Street, as I mentioned, who mentored me along the way. And then writing this book was, again, a deep dive into learning, once again, because I didn't know how to write a book. And it was amazing what you could learn on the internet. I mean, it was, just Mary Carr, who writes about, writing memoirs, and a fantastic book called Save the Cat about structure, and then master classes. These things didn't exist when I was starting out. So you could basically study English, on your own. And so that's really how I did it. And, it was excruciating. That's all I can say. It's one of the hardest things I did. But there's, I don't know if it was as hard as making Sesame Street in Russia, but it was pretty hard.
Well, Natasha, in that response, you reminded me that you were doing, in almost every respect, Ulica Sesame at the same time you were doing Plaza Sesamo. There were
a couple of years.
By a couple of years. How, in that, which of these is not like the other one, World of Sesame Street? How different were the two experiences of producing one in Mexico and one in just barely post-Soviet Union?
Well, Mexico at that time, we were producing in Tijuana, and then later in Mexico City. And even though there were some problems in Mexico, for instance, there was an issue where the writers were writing the scripts the night before and shooting them the next day, and I thought, that's not going to create very high quality. So we ended up having to, with the Mexican executive producer, shut down the production and write the scripts, and then move the whole thing to Mexico City, to Televisa. So that was the biggest challenge in that production. You cannot compare the challenges to that happened in Mexico with what was going on in Russia, during one of the, largest historical transformations of our time. And then the fact that we're trying to make this show for a country's children makes it a very different experience than in other countries where, people have a fairly stable society compared to where Russia was at that time. I think people were very scared. It was a period of, for the West, incredible joy and euphoria, and for many ordinary people living in post-Soviet society, a period of incredible instability and uncertainty.
Thank you. And I know there are still other questions here. I saw a couple.
I have a question. Thank you so much for this talk. My name's Mary Newberger, and I am the professor of history here and also the director of our Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. So thank you for this wonderful talk. It was really exciting. I was already on YouTube going, okay, I got to go watch Ulica Sesame because it looks fascinating. So in listening to your talk, one thing struck me. There was a moment in which you were talking about how dealing with children's education was, I think you said, not political. It was more emotional in the kind of responses you were getting from parents and kind of the sort of the content and the way you were dealing with it. And it made me realize, we haven't really dealt much with children's media at this conference. And we talked about TikTok. It was a little bit more about, data being collected, et cetera. But it seems to me that children are actually, at the moment, at the center of American culture wars, filtering of education, deciding what people can teach and can't, this idea that children are being indoctrinated, even not just in K through 12, but also in higher education. There's all kinds of bills in front of the Texas legislature right now. So it seems like if it wasn't political then, it is now, and for sure in the United States, and I'm sure also in Russia in different ways, which may have something to do with it being banned. So I'm just wondering if you wanted to comment a little bit on sort of media for children and the politics of that across both maybe the Russian, American, or in the global media space.
There's a lot of similarities, to what we experienced. And I would say that the discussion of the educational content for the show wasn't political. It was political, but it was emotional. It was both. I mean, there were, at every point, from the music to the script writing to the set design, it was political. But because it addressed children much in the same way, these discussions are evoking, I'd say very strong responses in the U.S. because they deal with children too, about textbooks and everything else. But I do think that some of the lessons that we learned in creating the show are important for addressing a lot of these deep divisions that we have in the U.S. today and how you get to change. That's what I've been thinking a lot about lately. How was it possible to be in a room where you want to have a group of people move towards greater inclusivity? How does that change happen? And that's what I've been thinking a lot about and kind of mulling over the specifics of the discussions that happened in the 1990s, because just as there was one question about, generational change, we had enormous generational clashes working in Russia between the young people and the older people, the values of the Soviet Union versus people who were open to new ideas. So I think about the specifics of those, the resolution of those various questions as they related to scripts and music. And I hope when people, read the book that they see some of those lessons and how that happened, how that transition took place. But it takes time. I mean, that's a big part of the problem, is that, you have to put people with differences of opinion in the same room, and they can't be so isolated and atomized from each other, both on social media and in real life in their niche media, and then expect them to find commonality. There has to be a way to bring people of diverse views together in the same space, whether it's virtual or whether it's in person, in order for that change to happen. And if that can't happen, and media can't help that happen, then you can't see that change, which is a threat to democracy. I will say one thing I did find out while doing a little research lately is that the teachers in Russia, all across Russia, now have a script that they read related to how they talk about the war. There have been some articles about this, and this is just terrifying to see. This is like the 70s or the 80s in the Soviet Union.
Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm an undergraduate here in Greece. And I was wondering, you've touched on it a little bit. I know you mentioned you traveled back in 2016 and 2020 to give interviews. Can you speak a little bit on how the sentiments of your colleagues have changed from the 90s to the 2010s? Do they still have the same hope? Have they abandoned hope? Have they joined the Putin camp?
99.9% have not joined the Putin camp, although some have. And when the war broke out, this is, after I came back. So I sent out a WhatsApp message that was very neutral because I wanted to kind of just hear people's views, and I didn't know where people were going to fall on this. And then started having conversations with people. This is following on the January 2020 time. And at that point, if you compare with 30 years earlier, when the show came out and there was, just so much hope that things could change, and that they were a part of that change. But it's not as if, Russia was moving towards democracy. There were still people being killed and poisoned, and the same, lack of rule of law existed, lack of a workable constitution, all the elements that you need to build a democracy, including a free press. The free press was progressing, much further than some of these other elements were, which take longer. You look at the United States; it took 200 years. Not to mention Europe, before that, where there was a template at least. So most people, I think, felt great impatience to see Russia turn into something faster than was actually going to be possible. My colleagues were very depressed in January of 2020. And when the war broke out, a number of them had been active protesting against the war, the special operation. And many of them had to leave within 24 hours after Putin passed the law against speaking out against the war on social media. And they went to Yerevan, Tbilisi. Some countries, like Germany, accepted a few. Those who were Ukrainian, told me they didn't feel comfortable in Moscow, so they ended up sort of going underground in smaller villages in Russia because they couldn't leave. So, it's a heartbreaking situation. For the Ukrainians, absolutely horrific. And for the Russians who can't speak out, many who have children, and they can't afford to be arrested. And it's horrible to see this. So I don't think there's a lot of hope at this point. And that's I would say the only solace from this is that the chief director said, I hope I put my faith in this generation that grew up on our show, and that they will be the ones to stop this madness.
Hi, I am Lara Taropin. I'm a alumni of our CREASE program and the LBJ school here, and I'm a program coordinator with the Kennan Institute right now. Kind of almost asking for a sequel to your book, maybe like the post-credits scene, but just kind of, wondering what have you been up to? Because, this was such a transformative period of your life, and I'm just curious to see how you applied what you did in Russia to sort of the rest of your career and how that sort of, informed what you've been doing since then.
Well, I had 2 children when I came back, and then I ran a media company which was called Ingredients for Education while my children were growing, and created television, a program called Kickin' Nutrition, which is a musical comedy cooking show that teaches kids about healthy eating, and then developed a game that promotes critical thinking related to food and health. And so I moved into the nutrition health area because I had learned a lot about how problems of obesity were impacting children. So I ended up staying in children's television for quite a while until Trump got elected. And then I just was watching the news and I thought, I have to go back to Russia. This is just driving me crazy. And I wanted to make a film which was going to be called, Hey Trump, Putin is not your bro. And then,
So I've been told by my producer that we have time for one more question, one last question.
anyway, that film is called Russian Millennials Speak Openly About America. And I ended up then getting back into making short documentaries and then getting back to Russia. And, now, of course, this is, where I am. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your great talk. My name is Rebecca Johnson. I'm a postdoc here in the history department. You talked a lot about the production of Sesame Street in Russia, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the reception and sort of some of the feedback that you got when it first came out and over the years. Did people send you letters? How you heard back from what it meant to people who watched the show, and sort of any of the particular stories that you heard about what it meant to people that are meaningful to you?
That's a great question. It was before the internet era, so we got letters, much like the VOA Slava, who was such a name earlier. And the letters were incredible. Things like, I can tell you one example of, I have these letters in my house now. One little girl said, I love Zeli Boba. He's my favorite Muppet. The reason I love him is because he's not afraid to make mistakes, and he makes them and he doesn't get in trouble for them. So there were a number of letters, and then there was a whole research team that evaluated the impact of the show through the workshop. It just became very popular. I have some, I take that with some honesty that there was also very little children's television production going on at that time. So we have to weigh that in, when your show is being nominated for an Emmy, which, the ATEFI, which is a Russian equivalent, there really weren't that many children's shows. But that said, if you see the show, it is a incredibly sophisticated, brilliant show because we had so many, we had such a strong creative team, and they worked around the clock. I mean, it was the kind of show, they were very focused on how do we make this the kind of show that children will love to watch and can also help them and educate them.
So thank you all so much for the incredibly, incredibly terrific questions. And I hope you'll all join me one last time in thanking Natasha Lance Rogoff for the wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. It was really fun.